off and get us to thinking a little bit more about just some general terminology so we can have a really good, productive conversation and speak the same language. And I'm going to start out, first of all, with thinking about FME, as we say it here at PERC, or free market environmentalism. And what is free market environmentalism? We talk about free market environmentalism, we're thinking about really just trying to use the marketplace and allow the marketplace to help us protect the environment, to increase and enhance our environmental quality. And there's a number of different ways that the marketplace can help us do that. And sometimes the market is fairly efficient at doing that, and sometimes it's not quite as efficient at doing that. So we're going to play around all week with some of those areas of where the market works really well and where it doesn't work really well. We're also going to look a lot at where the government steps in or the public sector steps in, and when the public sector can work well and the public sector doesn't work well. So when we're talking about free market environmentalism, we're also often thinking about sort of this private choice and the private choice to protect the environment and us as individuals to protect the environment versus the public choice and choosing for the public sector to protect the environment for us and to tell us how to protect the environment. So we're really looking for at that different choice mechanism. And we're going to play around with the incentives of those different choices and how those work. I want to start here thinking a little bit about rhinos. We talked about rhinos, or you read about rhinos in Wheeler's piece, and sometimes we talk about externalities, right? We'll get back to externalities later. Sometimes we have what we call externalities, and that is when there's a third party that's impacted by somebody else doing something, and that third party is not agreeing to that outside noise. So we'll talk a lot about these externalities, and I'm going to come back to that idea of externalities really in regards to property rights, okay? Because if we think about externalities and we have really secure property rights, then we're going to internalize all those other actions, and we're not actually going to have any externalities. So sometimes here at PERC, Terry Anderson, our former executive director, would say, we don't want to use that word, right? Externalities is a bad word. We don't want to use that word because it acts as though markets aren't solving some problem, but in fact, it's because we don't have secure property rights. So my focus today is really going to be thinking about secure property rights, and when we have secure property rights, we won't see those externalities. So I want you to sort of think about that idea as we move forward as well. So with those ideas in mind, how can selling corn save rhinos? Right? We look at our rhinoceros. Whelan in his piece talked a little bit about both black and white rhinos, and both of them are dropping in numbers. The story that I have here about John Hume is actually about the white rhinoceros. So how can selling corn save rhinos? John Hume has a ranch in South Africa. He owns about 16,000 acres. He has about 1,160 rhinos. And he protects those rhinos, and he pays for protecting his rhinos by cutting the rhino horn and selling it. So he has private land, and he cuts off the rhinoceros horn in order to save the rhinoceros. Now, rhinoceros horn is like fingernails. It grows, right? It just grows back. It doesn't have any sensitivity in it, in the end of it. And so you actually can cut the rhinoceros horn and not harm the rhino. He's ranching these rhinos, so he's feeding these rhinos. And in 2008, South Africa decided that they weren't going to allow that trade anymore. If you look at international trade, CITES is one of our international treaties actually that prevents or bans trade of rhinoceros horn and elephant tusks and other things at an international level. But South Africa was allowing for this trade within their own country. And in 2008, they decided that they were no longer going to allow for this trade because rhinoceroses are declining in numbers. But when we looked at what was happening for poaching in South Africa, if you go to 2000, we had 12, and again, this is our white rhinoceros, so you had 12 that were being poached in 2001, 9, 2002, 25, so we're sort of seeing some numbers jump around there. And apparently the demand for this rhino horn in Asia has been increasing, as we've been increasing the wealth in many Asian countries. And the horn is used for medicinal purposes in these Asian countries. And in 2008, as I said, South Africa decided that poaching was really becoming a problem, and we wanted to make sure that people were not harming these rhinoceros, that we were continuing to protect the rhinoceros. And what happens when you reduce the amount of horn on the marketplace? What happens to price? It goes up, right? We decrease the supply, we're going to increase that price. So what do you think happened to the number of poachers and the amount of poaching that took place in South Africa when we suddenly banned all trade? It went up. So the point of this law was to try to protect the rhinoceros, and the result, the unintended consequence, was that we saw more poaching because that price went up. And we also saw less protection. And here's John Hume saying, wait a minute, I made a lot of money raising rhinoceros and ranching rhinoceros and selling this horn, and now I can't pay to protect my rhinoceros anymore. Right? So when we create different types of property rights and we change the characteristics of those property rights, we change the incentives, we change the behavior of the individuals. John Hume was not going to be able to continue to ranch the rhinoceros. He actually took this to court, and just in March of this past year, they've decided that they're going to allow for the trade again, but as far as I know, the trade has not begun up again. Again, it would just be within South Africa, but giving these individuals that are actually ranching these rhinoceros, that are protecting the species, the ability to protect those species and make a profit doing so. So John Hume here would be one of these individuals that's a free market environmentalist, or what we oftentimes here at PERC call an enviropreneur. Right? He's an entrepreneur that's protecting the environment. So we look at the rhinoceros, is it an asset or a liability? Exactly. If the trade is legal, it becomes an asset, because suddenly we can profit on those rhinoceros. But if it's illegal, it's a liability. You're taking care of this animal, or maybe it's just out in the wild and it's trampling your fields and destroying your homes and your water tanks, etc., which we'll look at in a minute. Then it becomes a liability, right? And then people are no longer interested in trying to save that, just on average, if we are turning them into a liability. So what we want to do is take the environment and turn it into an asset instead of a liability, right? We want to make people interested, or help people become more interested in protecting the environment and motivating them to protect the environment by turning those environmental quality aspects into an asset instead of a liability. So that brings me to this basic idea of property rights. And I think property rights underline what's really important with regards to markets and markets protecting the environment. So I want to have a very specific language about talking, very specific language about property rights. So we're all talking the same language. And I'm going to start with the most important property right, at least in my mind, and that is human rights, right? The right to self, the right to self-determination. Does anybody know who this is? Yes, this is Malala. Malala was shot in Pakistan in 2012, and she was shot by an extreme group of Taliban because she tries to speak out for individuals, for individual rights, for ladies' rights, for education, education for kids, education for women. She knew that she was putting herself at risk because she knew that in Pakistan there is still a struggle for the basic human right to self-determination. But she was willing to fight for that. So I want to keep in mind that property rights really are the ultimate human right, that right to self, but we don't have the right to harm other individuals along with that. So we talk about property rights. Property doesn't have rights, right? People have rights to property. Because we are individuals, humans are the ones that are going to define those rights and that are actually going to protect those rights. But does nature have rights? And that's a really tough question. And that's a question that we're going to address, especially at the end of our week here, when we have Eric Alston come talk with us. He's going to talk about natural rights and the rights of nature and the Constitution in Ecuador that now claims that nature does have rights. But I'd say when we're thinking about whether nature has rights or not, who defines those rights? We do. Right? Individuals have to define those rights in order for us to protect nature. So when we think about property rights, we oftentimes talk about them as a bundle of sticks. And it's both privileges and limitations on what we can do with our property. Right? So we can think of different bundles in the stick. If you own a gun, can you do anything with it? No. Right? So you have some limitations with it. Or with a car, can you go drive your car across all the fields? Most of the time you can't, right? There's some fields you can, but up on the MSU campus you certainly can't. So again, we have some restrictions on what we can do with it. But we also have some privileges and things that we can do with our property. If you own a piece of land that has no covenants or no homeowner association on it, you can build a house, you can plant trees, you can have pigs, cattle, whatever you want. If you live in a subdivision that has some covenants on it, maybe you can't raise pigs, right? In my subdivision, you can't raise pigs, but we can have horses. But we also have property rights on assets, right? We have rights to use things, to use that car, to use that pen, and we talk about that as ownership, right? That we own that right, and we can argue about how that ownership actually works. And if we're thinking about how markets are helping us protect the environment, we want to think very carefully about how that ownership works and what sort of characteristics are in that property right that we have. So when we're looking at our property rights, there's a very specific bundle of sticks that's really important for markets to function well, and particularly for markets to function well, to motivate people to protect the environment. So that's what I'm going to focus on, to thinking about what those characteristics are. And I do this with an acronym that I call the DDEAL of property rights. And that's just to help us remember these very specific characteristics. And there's a little bit of crossover between them, but it helps us think about what those key characteristics are to motivate environmental quality and to motivate individuals to steward the environment and to allow markets to really just function well. So the first D in my DDEAL of property rights is that it's definable. You know what you own. If this is my table here, this is my computer, I know exactly what it is, I can define what it is, I can tell other people what it is, and we can agree that that is indeed mine, and I know what is mine. The first house that my husband and I owned here in Montana, when we went to buy it many, many years ago, we had this great realtor, and she said, it's a beautiful piece of property, it's 4.5 acres, and it goes to the third fence. And we went, oh, yay, this is so much fun, we're buying a house. The house was kind of a dump, but it had this beautiful piece of land. So excited about it. So we can see the first fence here, the second fence, and then way out here, you can see that third fence. Well, the day before closing on the property, our realtor gives us a call, and she says, everything looks wonderful, there's just one little detail. The property boundary is the second fence, not the third fence. And we said, oh, there's just one little detail, we're not closing tomorrow. Right? So we went out to the property and we found all the boundary posts, and indeed the property went to the second fence, and that was 4.5 acres. My husband and I are both from Seattle, and the third fence, if you looked at that piece of property, was 10 acres. But we had no idea how big an acre was because we never thought about property in acreage. We always thought about property in lot sizes, right? We still bought the property, but I want you to imagine what might have happened if we purchased that property thinking that it went out to the third fence. And what would happen when some individual, which became our neighbor, comes in and starts to build a house in between the second and the third fence? We would have gone to court, we would have tried to sue them, we would have lost tons of money because we would have been in the wrong, right? Because that was not our property. So just knowing what you own is pretty important. But I also want you to think for a moment about what might happen if we bought that property and we were told it only goes to the first fence. So we have this other piece of land sitting out there that nobody owns and that nobody thinks they own. And if you live here in Montana and you don't manage your pasture land, things start to grow. But they're not always things that we want. So again, we might have a different type of an issue if nobody thinks they own a certain piece of property. I'm not talking about a commons, we'll get back to that commons later, but just that nobody actually owns it. Knapweed is a really nasty, noxious weed here in Montana, and if you don't use forage land for very long, that knapweed will come up, and then it will start to spread on the neighbor's land, and again, we would have become liable for that, right? So knowing what you own is pretty important. The second D in the DDEAL is that your property is defendable. You can defend your right to your property. You know what you own, you can defend that right. And here in Montana, we see a lot of fences. We also have a lot of dogs, right? Barking dogs at the property line. And here in Montana, we also have a lot of individuals that have guns, right? So there's lots of different ways we can think about protecting our property. In the United States, we tend to rely on the enforcement of the police. And we have titles and we have deeds to help us secure our property. We can argue about whether this is the best way or not, but it lowers the transaction cost for us to protect our property. Now, a number of years ago in our Enviropreneur program that we had an individual that came from Costa Rica. And she had some fascinating stories. I don't even remember what it was that her environmental project was, but what I remember so distinctly is in Costa Rica, she said that there are squatters' rights. And so when she leaves her land in Costa Rica, if she's gone for any length of time, other individuals can come, camp on her land, and if she doesn't go back fairly quickly and kick them off, then that land will eventually become theirs. They have legitimate squatters' rights. She said, so when I leave my land, I don't leave for a very long period of time, first off, and when I come back, I take a gun. I take that sidearm. I've never had to use it, but I take it and I walk my property line and I make sure that there's nobody squatting on my land to ensure that I have that property right. Now, I don't know about you, if people are thinking this is sort of the Wild West, this might be kind of fun, my husband would probably like this kind of thing. That's not the way I want to live, right? I like having my property rights protected, but that is another way of defending your property rights. But when we have good enforcement, it lowers the transaction cost. We know what we own, and we can defend that right. So if we're thinking again about my table up here, and this is my table, or let's just say the computer, maybe a little bit easier, this is my computer, and we don't have that defendable right, one of you can just come up, you can grab my computer, you knock me out, you run away with it, right? And I have no recourse, I don't have a very strong property right. I'm the individual that has to go after you and try to bring that back. It's a very different type of a law, and it's going to change the way I treat my property. I'm going to be much more, I'm going to secure my property better, right? But I may not treat my property as well if I know there's a lot of people that are bigger than me that are likely to steal my property. So it's going to change the incentives in how I deal with my property. So the E in my deal of property rights is that it's excludable. That is, I can exclude others from using my property. I can allow others to use my property, but I have the ability to exclude others and say that you can't use my property. This is mine, and I have rights here. And on our 4.5 acres, my husband and I have this beautiful garden. We love to garden. And in Montana, we can grow a lot of really big zucchinis and green tomatoes. And every now and then they turn red. And sometimes we can grow a few other items out there. But just imagine if we're growing our beautiful garden, and every time our neighbors walk by, they're free to just pick our produce, right? So they come by and they steal our zucchinis every time they go by. Are we going to invest in continuing to grow this beautiful garden? And we're not. You know, unless just out of the goodness of our heart, we want to garden for our neighbors, which we do give our neighbors a lot of our produce, because you can only eat so many zucchinis. But nonetheless, if people are stealing all of our produce, we're not going to spend the time to ensure that we have this beautiful garden. So having that excludability, again, is going to change the incentives in how we manage our property. So I want to tell you a story about the Berry Bikes. And this was probably about 15 years ago. Berry College in Georgia created what they called the Berry Bike system. And the student body voted to purchase a whole bunch of bikes, and they put these big yellow license plates on the back of them that said Berry Bike. And the Berry Bikes were available on campus for anybody to use. So you could walk up to one hall, hop on a bike, ride across campus to another hall, hop off the bike, go to class, come out. That bike was probably gone because somebody else had ridden it somewhere else on campus, but there was another bike there for you. So you could hop on the other bike and away you go across campus. And one of my associates said, you know, the first week of this program, it was really cool. It was really fun and it was neat, and you really could hop on these bikes and just ride them across campus. So by the second week, you had to be a little bit careful because the pedals might be a little bit bent or the seat may not be quite right, but it was still pretty darn cool. So by the fourth week of this program, the bikes were hanging from trees. Literally, people had taken the bicycles and thrown them in the trees, and the bikes were hanging from the trees. Now, why? Why would students do this? Students were paying for the bikes. Okay? What are they thinking? So I want you to imagine for a moment that here up at MSU, I talked about the duck pond. Right here up at MSU, we have this duck pond, and there's this paved pathway that goes down to the duck pond. And I just want you to imagine that I have a cat bike, because we're bobcats here in Montana, or here in Bozeman. I have a cat bike, and I created this little bike jump to go over the duck pond, and I'm standing at the top of the cement trail, ready to ride down and jump the duck pond, and you're all standing there along with 300 of my other students from class. What are you going to tell me to do? You have a pretty good idea that my jump is not big enough to clear the pond. You're going to tell me to don't do it? What are you gonna say? Go for it. I do this in class with 300 students, and I get this chant, do it, do it, do it. So here I am getting ready to write, whoo, you know I'm gonna, you know, they're not worried about me at all. I'm gonna kill myself trying to do this. Nonetheless, they're egging me on to do it. I'm gonna destroy the bike, right? So why are you encouraging me to do that? Don't you care if it's your bike? Everybody owns it. Don't you guys care about your bikes?
The value of the entertainment you provide is greater than the small and dispersed value.
It'd be good entertainment, and you may not have class for the rest of the semester because I may not be able to think it or function anymore, right? And if I'm not doing that to the bike, somebody else might be doing that to the bike, right? Nobody owns it. There's very little incentive to protect it because you might be that one individual telling me to protect that bike, but we have all these other students that are ready to go out there and throw bikes at trees and jump the duck pond and actually maybe make it. You know, all these other individuals that are thinking of these bikes as great recreation, right? Maybe perhaps more so than this lovely ability to get from one side of campus to the other side of campus for the rest of the year. That personal gratification for the moment might be a little more valuable. But I want to take this a little bit further because there's also in Seattle, I grew up in Seattle, and there is this outdoor mall called University Village, and it's in Seattle. And what does it do in Seattle? It rains. Why they put an outdoor mall in Seattle, I'm not totally sure. It's a beautiful mall, and it's sort of a high-end, high-scale mall. And to get around this fact that you have to walk from one store to the other store outside, they have these barrels of umbrellas that sit outside most of the stores. And they're these bright yellow umbrellas, and I have done no robust analysis on this, but I visit Seattle a lot. And I've always noticed that these umbrellas are in pretty good shape. I've never seen any brand new ones. I'm sure they replace them from time to time, but they're in pretty good shape. I never have seen any hanging from trees or being messed with. Why is that? How come people are taking care of the umbrellas, but they're not taking care of the bikes? Everybody owns them in the same sense, right? They're owned by the mall, but everybody has the right to use them, just like the umbrellas. So why are people treating the umbrellas differently? Okay, maybe there's some cameras watching people, it's upscale, although, you know, there were a lot of people watching me try to ride over the duck pond, right? And that didn't stop people from trying to egg me on to ride over the duck pond. And we can think of other uses of these umbrellas. My boys are now grown, but when they were little, we would often go to the U Village to go shopping, which was not their favorite thing to do. And they saw these yellow umbrellas the first time, and they were probably about, I don't know, 7 and 8. And you see this big long umbrella. What does it look like? Gosh, they ran to that barrel, they grabbed umbrellas, they were so excited. It took less than 2 seconds for somebody to come up to them and say, that is inappropriate use of those umbrellas. And it was not my mother. This is my mother standing under this umbrella. Had they been given another second, it would have been her. It was not her. It was a complete stranger that came up and said, this is not appropriate use. There's a very different cultural norm at this high-scale mall than there is on campus with the bikes. And cultural norms matter, right? They were shaming my boys for using these umbrellas in a way, and they never touched those umbrellas again, I guarantee you. Now, there might have been other people messing with umbrellas at some time, and it might have taken a little bit longer, but it's very different than the do it to ruin the bicycle and the inappropriate behavior with the umbrella, because those informal norms matter. Right? And they are part of our property rights, and that actually was one way to exclude inappropriate use of the umbrellas, but that didn't fall through with the Berry bikes. In fact, the Berry bikes, after a couple of months, they pulled them all back in, they fixed them up, they tried the experiment again, the exact same thing happened, they pulled them all back in, they fixed them up, and they leased them. And one individual was responsible for taking care of the bike, and one individual got that right to exclude other people from use of that bike. So that idea of excludability changes how we're going to manage our asset, whatever that asset might be. So when we get to the A of my deal of property rights, it means appropriable. That is, it's tradable. We can trade our asset, we can sell our asset, we can lease our asset, we can allow somebody else to use it. And appropriability is more important than people oftentimes think. So I want to take you back to my lovely garden where we grow zucchinis and tomatoes, and think about what if my husband and I decided that we wanted to go to the farmer's market and sell produce. Now, most people don't want to buy big, huge zucchinis, and most people don't want to buy green tomatoes. And what I've actually found in the last couple of years, what people really do want to buy right now is kale. Kale is like the superfood of the world, and people want to buy kale. So if my husband and I are going to the farmer's market and we're going to sell some of this produce, what are we gonna grow? Kale, right? We're gonna pay attention to what other people want, and we're going to buy that or grow that kale so we can sell that kale, because that's where we're gonna make a profit, even if we don't like kale, right? We're suddenly acknowledging what other people want. So when it comes to the environment, we can think about these individuals, but we just want to call them environmental psychopaths, or these crazy people. They just want to destroy the environment, right? But it doesn't matter if people want to destroy the environment. If we have secure property rights, they're going to manage that environment considering the value that other people have for those resources and how other people want to use those resources, right? So we can have environmental psychopaths, we can have crazy people like my husband and I that like zucchinis and green tomatoes, yet we will still grow kale if we're going to sell that so that other people will enjoy it. What we've actually learned on our property is that we don't even have to go to the farmer's market because there's something else that people want with our lovely piece of land, and we've taken the size of our garden and shrunk it down just a little bit because what people in Montana really want is horse pasture land. And so if we take our land and we put a nice little shed on it and we rent it out for people to put their horses on, especially during the summer months, we can make some pretty decent money just allowing people to put their horses on our land. And we get better money if we have a little shed on it. Now, I love horses. I love to ride. In my mind, they're too high maintenance. I do not want to own a horse. And I don't even want to take care of one. I don't even want to go out there and feed. And I can watch the horses. And sometimes we get somebody that has a horse in there that I can actually go ride. And they come and take care of it. Right? I fill the water. It's a pretty good deal. But I do that because my land is appropriable. Right? And I can lease that land. And now I have realized what some of the alternative uses are. And that's a really important component when we're thinking about environmental quality, that we want to consider other people's values. And if we don't have secure rights and this appropriability, then we're not going to take as much consideration of other people's values because we're not going to be able to profit from it. If we look at some of our water rights, and we've had a number of our readings that were thinking about water, here in Montana, if you go back into the 1990s, we had a lot of dry streams because water was not appropriable. It's still extremely costly to trade water, and some states allow for trading of water and some states don't, particularly for in-stream flow. So if we're not allowing for that appropriability, we're not allowing for that trade, we have individuals and farmers that are watering their landscapes. They often do it under a use it or lose it law, right, as we read about. That is, if they don't use that water right, they might lose the rights to that amount of water in the future. So they continue to water even during days like today when it's raining out because they need to use their allocation. And they don't have the right to sell it to somebody else or to lease it to somebody else. Now again, in many states that is changing and has changed. And here in Montana, we have a lot more in-stream flow right. A lot of it is still publicly managed, but nonetheless, we're trying to change those characteristics of the property right so that we can allow for that trade, so that we can allow for that in-stream flow, and it's benefiting both the farmer who has the actual ownership right, and it's benefiting the fish, and it's benefiting the recreationists that want to go fishing or floating the river or anything else. It's benefiting the environment. But when we didn't have that appropriability, we did see a lot of dry streams here in Montana. So the L in my deal of property rights is that people must be liable. They need to be liable for harm done. So when my husband and I are growing our lovely vegetables, if we're out there spraying all these nasty chemicals, and those chemicals are going onto our neighbor's land, and it's doing something nasty to our neighbor's land, we're liable for that, right? We need to be responsible for that because we have the property right to do what we want on our land as long as we're not harming somebody else. So that idea of liability is again really important, and particularly when we're thinking about the environment. Right? If we're polluting on somebody else, we need to be responsible for that pollution. We want to make sure that we take care of that harm or in one way or another and negotiate with the individual that's being harmed in order to essentially eliminate those externalities, right? So come back to the idea of externalities, such as our phones. And so somebody define an externality for me. We have a lot of economists in here. Okay, so an external cost would be, we have an individual or a group of individuals that are doing some action and they're harming somebody else, and they're harming some non-consenting party. So there's some negative impact on that third party. It might have a positive effect, right? We could think of my neighbors going by our garden and they love to just look at that beautiful garden, so it might be a positive externality, right? But when we think about externalities again, if we actually have the deal of property rights, or what I would call secure property rights, we won't have externalities. They will be internalized. If I'm liable for any harm done, then I'm going to negotiate with my neighbors and we're going to make a deal. It doesn't mean I'm not going to pollute anything, but it means that we're going to negotiate and now they are part of the package and maybe I'm compensating them. Or maybe if we have some benefits from my beautiful garden and my neighbor says, you know, I don't really want to grow a garden, I love walking by your garden, but I'd like just a little bit more kale in your garden because you give us all this great produce and it's an externality. And so we make a deal, right? And it doesn't have to be dollars and cents that are going past. Are being passed. It might even just be them saying, we like that, and we're neighborly, and we like to have our neighbors, and we like to be friendly with our neighbors. So we're all benefiting from that deal. But if we have secure property rights, then those externalities will be internalized. So I want you to think about that as we move forward as well. When do we have externalities, and do you agree that that word externality really just means a lack of secure property rights? So here in the United States, we have a pretty strong rule of law, and we oftentimes rely on what we call the common law, and we'll hear more about the common law from Roger Miners on Friday. But the common law does protect that right of a clean environment and basically enforcing people to be liable for harm done. And the common law has been fairly effective at doing that. And I'm going to leave that for Roger to discuss, but as we move forward as well, I want you to think about what sort of laws exist out there that are helping protect the environment, and what sort of laws exist out there that may have some very serious unintended consequences that instead of helping the environment are actually harming the environment. All right, so that's my deal of property rights. And again, when we talk about secure property rights, when we talk about just property rights, most people don't think of all these components within there, and they are really, really important. And so you might already know that these are really important components, but when you're talking to somebody else, they may not know anything about these components or may have never thought about property rights in any sense other than I own something, right? So when we're talking about environmental protection and secure property rights, we need to clarify that there are some very key characteristics that we have with those property rights in order to motivate that environmental quality and motivate people to continue to steward the environment. So I want to take us back a little bit and say, well, where do property rights come from then? How do they come about? And property rights actually evolve over time, and they evolve when the benefits of defining those rights begin to outweigh the cost of defining those rights. And I have here P.J. Hill. P.J. was one of your authors in your readings, and P.J. is a longtime PERC, a fourth-generation rancher. His great-granddad homesteaded a piece of land in eastern Montana, and when he did that, if you think about eastern Montana, you compare it to the Dakotas, it's fairly arid, there's not a whole lot of trees, there's a whole lot of land, and back in the late 1800s, individuals came out to ranch their cattle, and they looked at these big expanses of land. We had homestead laws that provided a certain amount of acreage that wasn't really sufficient for most individuals to make money and to make a living on ranching. So essentially these individuals came out, they would homestead a piece of land, they'd use some of the land adjacent to their land for forage, and they'd graze their cattle. And as more people started to come west, then they'd see that somebody was already on that piece of land, they'd move a little bit further down, and they'd graze their cattle. Again, some of it was land that they'd actually homesteaded, and maybe some of it was excess to what they could legally homestead. And people continued to come in and ranch that way. And at some point, that land became scarce. And as that land became scarce, we started to have more conflict because people really only had a property right to that land they homesteaded, and others were trying to come in and get some grazing rights, and then we had sheep herders coming in and across the land. So we started to see more and more conflict as we started to see more and more individuals coming in the land. And we would normally think, at least in today's terms, we say, well, why don't you just fence off your land, right? At least you could protect your specific piece of land. But when you look at these landscapes, there wasn't enough wood. There wasn't enough wood for people to go out and fence these lands. And so the idea of protecting that property right was really costly. And one way they did it was they'd hire cowboys. They'd hire the range riders, and the range riders would ride the line, the boundary of their land, and originally the boundary of their land and the other land they were using, trying to protect that property right. It's a pretty difficult way, a pretty costly way to protect a property right. Now there was an amazing invention that came in this same era, fairly close after this, and that was barbed wire. And barbed wire was the technology of the day for the rancher in the late 1800s and early 1900s, because now they could actually define and defend their property right in a much larger way than they previously could, just by bordering in that property to say, this is mine, right? So we think about property rights today, and we can think about the oceans and some of these other areas that we don't have really secure property rights on. We are coming up with new technologies that are enabling us to create better property rights. And as simple as we think of barbed wire now, think about GPS systems and the technology that we have, that we actually could start thinking about homesteading the oceans and creating property rights on the oceans to try to allow for a more secure set of rights, right? To allow for that excludability and then that deal of property rights. So I said previously we were looking at rhinos, but we also want to think about other animals out there and what happens. We can ranch these animals, but sometimes it's hard to ranch wildlife, right? Maybe you don't want to ranch wildlife. And how do you fence in an elephant? That can be extremely difficult. But how then do we take this elephant that's foraging through, and a herd of elephants at that, that's foraging through somebody's village, wiping out the village, wiping out all the crops, destroying the water pumps, tearing it apart, liability or asset? A clear liability. Yet we have elephants that are becoming extinct. Population numbers are declining rapidly. How are we going to save those elephants? We've had these international laws that you can't trade in tusk and other things, and the elephant tusk is very different than the rhinoceros horn, and the elephant tusk is more like your teeth, right? They use it on a daily basis. They do grow, but the elephant needs those tusks in order to live, different than the rhinoceros. So, ranching elephants in order to produce horn isn't as feasible as it would be with rhinoceros. So we have to be a little bit more creative, and a number of communities have been much more creative, and we have different countries that have allowed for communal rights. Zimbabwe is one, who's sort of fell off the earth for a little while there while we had some political turmoil, but seems to be coming back into the environmental spectrum now. And in Zimbabwe, they created what we call Campfire, and Campfire actually allowed for communal rights for wildlife ownership. That is, communities could own the wildlife, they could fence it in or try to fence it in, but what they essentially did is they allowed for hunting for some wildlife, and they allowed for safaris, and they started turning these liabilities into an asset, right? Because now they could make money from it. In order to really think about managing wildlife, one individual would have a really hard time managing it, so again, they did it at this community level. And they would take the revenues that they earned, and those revenues we brought back into the community, and the community would determine how they were going to use those revenues. So different than we're thinking about some of our other individual rights in marketing of my tomatoes and zucchinis, but nonetheless trying to turn those liabilities into assets. And in Zimbabwe, the number of elephants was declining rapidly, and when they started the communal rights, the number of elephants increased considerably, and the number of wildlife increased considerably. Again, when the political turmoil took place under Mugabe, we had lots of issues all over in every direction in Zimbabwe, but it seems to be that we're getting some of those communal rights back, and we're seeing some environmental progress once again. Compare that to a country like Kenya, where no hunting is allowed. No hunting allowed at all in Kenya. Wildlife populations are declining rapidly and continue to decline. The only place in Kenya that they found wildlife populations actually increasing are on the reserves that they have, and there's a very small acreage of reserves in Kenya. And even there, we have a big issue with poaching in Kenya. because these animals tend to be liabilities instead of assets, and as they leave those reserves, people don't want them destroying their crops, etc., and they can make money from them in the black marketplace. So we need to change the incentives. So I want to think very carefully about the incentives and how people are managing things. So let's bring it home a little bit more, at least to us here in Montana. Say, well, how would you react to a wolf in your yard? Would you like that? And back in 1996, we reintroduced wolves into Yellowstone. And we had to reintroduce wolves into Yellowstone because earlier we eradicated wolves from Yellowstone. They were a natural part of the ecosystem. And the Park Service, back in the early 1900s, believed, or middle 1900s, the Park Service decided that they were a predator and they were killing some of the other species that we wanted to see, like elk, and so they were bad, and also killing cattle. They were bad, and so we were going to get rid of them so we could see the animals that we wanted in the park. Change the nature of the park, change the ecosystem of the park, come into the environmental era, 1960s, 70s, 80s, people are saying we need to reintroduce these wolves, but I want you to think about what that means to different people. Some people are very excited about this and say, yes, we want to reintroduce these wolves because they will bring back the ecosystem in Yellowstone. We're going to benefit from this. Most of the people that are saying this that are going to benefit from this are just thinking this is a lovely thing. They might actually go see some of the wolves in the park, but they are probably not living on the park border, trying to raise sheep, trying to raise cattle, or even raise a family, right? Very different incentives for different people in this particular situation. I want you to think very carefully about who benefits and who pays for this wolf reintroduction. We actually did reintroduce wolves in 1996. We reintroduced 6 wolves. We have lots of wolves in Yellowstone now. They are off the endangered species list at this point. And we have 50% fewer elk in Yellowstone now. So it's changing the ecosystem again, for better or worse, depending upon what sort of ecosystem you would like to see out there. Is it more natural? We eradicated the wolves, we put the wolves back. It depends what you're looking for. I don't know what natural means when man really impacts in every bit of nature around us. So think about who pays and who benefits. I want to introduce Hank Fisher here. And Hank Fisher was one of the individuals that was pushing really hard to reintroduce the wolves into Yellowstone. He was working with Defenders of Wildlife at the time, and he was traveling around the communities and trying to get people to buy into this, we need wolves back in Yellowstone. And he has a great story that all of us Perkies love to tell, because we can always just see Hank telling this story when we think about it. And he was at a meeting, a town hall meeting one day, and he was trying to get a reintroduction of wolves into one of these small communities surrounding Yellowstone. And he said he looked out in the crowd, and here's this big old rancher with his cowboy hat, and he's got his knife, and he's picking his teeth with his knife. And he looks up and he says, "Hank Fisher, ain't nobody killed you yet." That's the attitude they had towards Hank, right? He was the environmentalist, and they didn't really like Hank Fisher, so Hank Fisher's wearing the environmentalist hat here, right? He's wearing the bandana. And Hank Fisher realized that he's benefiting from this wolf reintroduction, but there are people that are paying the cost, and it's ranchers. At least that's one of the groups that's paying the cost, are these ranchers. So he came up with a compensation fund. Said, you know what, I need to get some buy-in here because I get it. I understand that there are going to be some serious cost to these individuals. And he had a picture painted of wolves, and he sold those pictures, became a poster, he sold those posters and created a compensation fund, and that compensation fund paid ranchers when they could prove that a wolf had harmed their cow. And he would pay them for the value of the cow. And if it was a calf, he would pay them for the value of the expected value of that calf as an adult cow when it was sold. And he ran that compensation fund, or Defenders of Wildlife ran that compensation fund for a long time until the wolf was pulled off the endangered species list. But it was that fund that got the buy-in from a lot more individuals and helped satisfy those ranchers to say, okay, it's not that we don't want wolves in the ecosystem, it's that we don't want wolves in our yard. We don't want wolves killing our cattle. And so he helped compensate them for that loss. And there were losses there. And that compensation fund paid a lot of ranchers for those losses. So we think of the PJ Hills in the world and the ranchers, and they're starting to say, okay, I get this, right? We have a very different hat, we have a very different perspective, but now we're starting to negotiate. Instead of just this political conflict of wolves or no wolves, and lobbying for one or the other, we're starting to see this cooperation. We're going to negotiate with each other and make these trades, right? We're creating a different set of property rights. They may not be a perfect deal of property rights or secure property rights, but we're trying to come back to create a better set of property rights so that we can make these negotiations and see some more cooperation. Okay? We have these other individuals that still may not be very happy about this deal if they're living next to the park, and now they're subject to wolves coming in their yard and taking their dogs, and that does happen. We also have these hunters. This is Terry Anderson here, our former executive director. We have hunters that are a little distraught by this situation. Not so much, I don't think, when we were introducing the wolves, but now that we have the wolves there, we literally have cut the elk herds in half, and that has impacted our hunters. So people have different perspectives, and so when we're thinking about environmental problems and how to solve some of these problems, you need to take your hat off sometimes and try on somebody else's hat and think about it from some different perspectives in order to try to really resolve some of these problems and come up with some win-win solutions. I do think that the compensation fund was a great market-type solution. It's not perfect, but it did provide for some of those trade-offs, and not for everybody. Not everybody's going to buy into that, right? So let's come back to our fisheries. We have global fisheries, and something like 90% of our global fisheries, our commercial fisheries, are collapsing. That is, we are fishing too much. We're catching too many fish. We're reducing the populations to a point where they may not be able to repopulate themselves if we continue down this path. Why? Are fishermen stupid? They just keep going out there and fishing and catching more and more and more fish? Why do they do that? Just imagine every one of you are fishermen. We're up in Alaska and we're fishing for halibut. Okay? We're all fishing for halibut, and we know that the halibut populations are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Are you going to stop fishing? Why not?
You know someone else will.
You know someone else will. Right? When we look at our fisheries, we have that typical case of the tragedy of the commons, because we don't have that right to exclude others from that fishery. So I might say, I really want to protect these fish, and I'm going to go out there and I'm going to stop fishing, and I'm going to try to tell other people to stop fishing. But as long as there's value in those fish, people are going to continue to go fish and pull more fish out, and those populations are going to continue to decline if we can't exclude others from that fishery, right? That is our tragedy of the commons. We don't have that right to exclude, and we don't always see the tragedy of the commons if we don't have the right to exclude, because sometimes resources aren't scarce, and sometimes we have those communities, like the yellow umbrellas, that people are actually get together and can negotiate. We look at our fisheries, we have so many individuals that are a part of this process that it's really hard to exclude everybody so that we can actually have a successful fishery without some other type of management going on. We can certainly have some informal and formal rights that exist there, and we'll talk more about those. But why don't fishers invest in their long-run profitability of conserving fish? Because if you, as one individual, try to conserve those fish, somebody else is likely to just come in and catch those fish, right? So you're not getting any bang for your buck. But then, why do fishermen invest in their boats and not the fish?
They own the boat.
They own the boat, right? You get a direct benefit from investing in your own boat, and in fact, the more you invest in your boat, the more likely you're able to get out there and catch more fish and become more profitable. So, next question, are shorter seasons and restricted technology effective to help us sustain the fishery? We've taken the halibut fishery up in Alaska, and for a period of time, we shortened it to 2 48-hour periods. Do you think that helped us reduce the catch? No. How can that be? We've taken it from months long to less than a week long, and we're catching more fish. How is that? Right? We invested more in our boats. We went out there, it's called the race to fish. There's literally, in these periods of time, there's a gun that goes off and people race out to fish for their 48-hour period, and they bring back all that fish, and they have this huge glut of fish. Do you think they're taking good care of those fish as they're catching them? No, they are catching as many fish as they can in a really short period of time, right? That has not been a very successful mechanism to reduce the collapse of fisheries. How about restricting technology? We actually have seen a number of different technology restrictions on fisheries. One, you couldn't use a motorboat, you had to sail in order to catch fish. Another one, you weren't allowed to use more than a 32-foot whole boat. You know, keep the boat small so they can't go out there and catch as many fish. Do you think that's going to be successful? We find ways of getting around things. So these are both 32-foot whole boats. Right? One is clearly safer than the other because one is very top-heavy, but it fits the regulation. And they could go out and catch a lot more fish in that large boat and still meet that regulation of having a 32-foot whole boat, right? So we tend to try to work our way around regulations, and again, we still saw more fish being caught in a shorter period of time with the technology restrictions that exist out there. So we can think about our different fisheries. This is where we were at up in halibut fisheries up in Alaska a number of years ago. Going out, it would have been better to have the perfect storm picture out here as well, but then you couldn't see all these boats tangling up. So we're out there, we're tangling our nets, we're cutting our nets, we're losing fish, we're trying to get as many fish as we can possibly get in the boat, getting them to port, we're wasting a ton of them, or we can create some form of property right. So in this particular situation, and in many of our fisheries across the world, we've created tradable quotas, sometimes called rations. And those tradable quotas are actually looking at the total estimated population of fish in the ocean, of that type of fish, and then using science to try to determine how many fish we actually need to leave in the ocean for it to be a sustainable population, and then allowing fishermen to catch the difference. So we have what we call an allowable catch, or a total allowable catch, a TAC. And we typically split that total allowable catch based on historic catch. So if we were all fishing in the ocean and I was catching 10% of the halibut originally, I would get 10% of that total allowable catch. It's a quasi-property right, right? Depending upon how those rights are defined is depending upon how secure those rights are. Different countries have different forms of security, if you will, on those rights. But nonetheless, it's motivating us now to allow to leave some fish in the ocean. We have that excludability. We're reducing the catch in order to hopefully increase the catch in the future, because now we have a sustainable population that will hopefully grow, and we get a percent of that TAC, which will hopefully grow as we have more and more fish in the ocean. So it's to our benefit as fishermen now to abide by these laws, not to say that they don't have to be monitored and don't have to make people accountable, because we do have to monitor them. But nonetheless, now we have a mechanism where we created a property right. We can actually trade our quota. That's the reason they're called tradable quotas. We can actually trade that quota and sell it to other people. So we have this property right. Now this is a market-based system. Government has created the market, right? Government went out there and decided how many fish we could catch and decided how we were going to allocate those fish. And then we use that determination to create a marketplace. So I already talked a little bit about enviropreneurs, and so as we work through this program, I want you to think about enviropreneurs and how many enviropreneurs you know, and how you might be able to better protect the environment and make a profit doing so. That is what an enviropreneur really is, right? Being an entrepreneur that protects the environment. And if we look at our property rights, we find that there's a pretty good correlation between the security of property rights and environmental performance. I've just taken this particular graph from Heritage just to demonstrate that there is this positive correlation that exists out there. Lots more analysis that we can do on this, but a simple analysis here does tell us that when we're looking at our property rights index, that we have a positive correlation between increased property rights and increased environmental protection. So, summing everything up, what's the deal with property rights and what's the deal with free market environmentalism? First of all, as Whelan said, incentives matter, right? And incentives are defined by the rule of the game. And the double D deal of property rights is part of the rules of the game, right? In economics, we often talk about institutions. I think it's a terrible word because nobody else knows what we mean. But when we're talking about those institutions, we're talking about the rules of the game. We're talking about the laws, formal, informal, property rights, regulations, restrictions, enforcement, all those things are part of the rules of the game that are defining the incentives that people are going to behave according to. Perspective matters, right? Which hat are you wearing? We all see the world slightly differently, and we're all going to come about with some different types of solution and different types of values. And that's why tradable rights help us internalize use, if you will, or the highest valued use, Because when we allow for that trade, we start to realize that other people might have higher valued uses than us, and we can both win by negotiating how we use those resources. And our entrepreneurs are out there turning liabilities into assets. But I think it's also important for us to consider that markets give us the freedom to choose. We can do some comparison, and we'll do some comparison throughout the week, thinking about how private actions work and how public actions work. And one of the benefits for the marketplace is that it gives us the freedom to choose as individuals instead of somebody else the right to choose for us. We get to choose for ourselves, and it encourages that cooperation over conflict, right? We actually saw Hank Fisher out there trying to figure out how to get people to cooperate and how to get more cooperation and more negotiation, so we weren't just butting heads with this conflict, and how to use our resources. So it became more of a market type system than a political decision. And finally, secure property rights ensure accountability. And I think that's really important, and one of those ideas that many people don't think about when they think about property rights and how property rights might help us protect the environment. With that, I have about 10 more minutes if we have any questions.
So we talk about, especially in Africa, giving kind of community rights over like elephants and stuff, but doesn't that then turn it into kind of a tragedy of the commons type thing? So like, how does that work?
Okay, great question. So when we look at these community rights, sometimes we have communities that run into the tragedy of the commons, and sometimes we don't. And anybody familiar with Ostrom's work, she's done a lot of study looking at different communities across the globe to try to figure out why it is that some communities are able to actually negotiate and resolve that tragedy, and other communities are not. And in my mind, it comes down to, when I'm looking at her work, it comes down to what I would call managed rights versus not having the rights. And when we have these communities that are able to actually eliminate that tragedy, they have secure property rights. They may not be formal, right? They may be very informal, and that is part of the key, is that we can have these informal rights. With our yellow umbrellas, we had informal rights, and we were able to still take care of the yellow umbrellas. But if we don't have that ability, then we might see the tragedy of the commons. And when you look at some sort of, I'm going to call them commune groups, I guess, community groups here in the United States, we have the Amish, we have the Hutterites, and other type groups. We find that those groups tend to split when they get to be about 100 to 150 people, and for a number of reasons, but one of the reasons they do that is because it's hard to manage that big of a community, and they start to get a bunch of free riders when you get beyond that size. An individual here at PERC did some research and came up, I think the number was 126, that the average size of a community that could work well was something like 126, and they were looking at campfire groups and the Amish and all sorts of different global groups and playing around with Eleanor Ostrom's ideas. But the reason is because we actually have some form of secure rights, even if they're informal rights. But there has to be that deal has to be there in order to protect, in order to prevent the tragedy from occurring. We have to have some excludability if there is scarcity. Yeah.
I remember reading that there were like more groups trying to spread this idea of like tradable quotas with regards to fishing like throughout North America. But I remember that like Congress passed a law that like prevented it from being spread to other places for several years because of like certain fishing interests. So why were they opposed to it?
Okay, yeah, so there was a moratorium for a while here in the United States, and there's a lot of fishing groups that are not interested in this. So you think about the stake. Typically, when we create tradable quotas here in the United States, they take that TAC, that allowable catch, and they divide it up based on historic catch. So we can think about, first of all, what if it's not divided by historic catch? What if you have to buy it right off the bat, and you're a fisherman, and now you have to buy your quota? Are you gonna be happy with that? Probably not. You're gonna have to fork out some money right off the bat, but that would be one way to allocate it. The other way, if we're thinking of the historical catch, and we're thinking that this is coming about in the next 4 or 5 years, what are you going to do right now? Catch more or less fish? You have the incentive to go out there and catch as many fish as you possibly can so that you can get a greater share when we're actually doing this allocation system. So part of it is the fear of how much am I going to get allocated, right? So I like my fishing system right now. Maybe I'm a really good fisherman. Maybe I just entered the market and so I'm not so good, but I think I'm going to get really good. how are they going to allocate those rights? And I may not be a winner in that deal. So part of the reason that we actually see that historical catch and the percent-based historical catch is to try to get the buy-in from different fishermen. But it's changing the laws is scary for people. And the same thing happens with our water rights. When we're talking about tradable water rights, people that own water are really nervous, or own water rights, use rights, all of our water is use rights. People that have those rights are oftentimes really nervous about this ability to trade or sell, because there's a lot of uncertainty that exists out there, and they're not sure that they're really going to win in this deal. And so there's a lot of backstepping in order to move these things forward. But again, part of the reason that we see some of the laws that we do is to get that buy-in. It may not be the most efficient way to allocate that resource right off the bat, but we need to get that buy-in so that we can take the next step and move forward. So I think that's another really important point about when we're thinking about solutions to environmental problems, we need to start from where we are, and we need to think about how we're going to get people to buy into some of these new policies, so that we can take them maybe a slower step than we would actually like to see. So I think there's a question here.
Yeah, I was just wondering, whether ITQs have ever worked successfully for migratory fish that move beyond the international borders.
Oh, okay, so one of the problems that we have when we're looking at our fisheries is that each individual country owns 200 miles out from your shoreline. So when you go beyond that 200 miles, you get into international treaty. And international treaty is less enforceable. So we've lost one of those, one of the components of the deal of property rights. I don't study fisheries in particular, so I can't tell you which ones have or have not worked. Costs are going to be higher because we don't have that defendability as well as we would when we're looking just within our own waters. Mm-hmm.
Going back to the wolves, so how do you create really well-defined solutions when you incorporate the morality of actually intervening?
If I'm understanding the question properly, I'm not sure we're ever going to satisfy everybody, right? But I do know if we're looking at a political allocation, then we tend to have a winner and a loser. It tends to be more of a zero-sum type game that Congress decides we're going to introduce wolves into Yellowstone. Boom, now we have wolves. Sorry, ranchers, sucks to be you, right? Whereas if we allow for some of this marketplace to take place, then we at least have some negotiation. Again, there were individuals that lost in that deal, right? If you live right next to Yellowstone and suddenly you have wolves that are eating your dogs, and it does happen, then you may not have liked that deal, right? You may not have liked that deal. And in the marketplace, we don't always like the deals that come out, right? When we think about free market environmentalism, and I was just talking with some girlfriends the other day, and we were talking about timber and Plum Creek, who has sort of turned into a real estate business instead of a tree growing company. And they're very dissatisfied with the fact that Plum Creek goes out there and rapes and pillages the land. They remove all the trees and then they put houses up, for God's sakes, right? Well, the market is telling us that there's a pretty high value for having houses right there. And maybe we don't have really secure rights on some of the habitat and other types of diversity that we might want to see out there. So maybe there are some externalities that exist out there. But we also have groups like the Nature Conservancy that are willing to invest in helping to protect conservation. And we have a very wealthy society that really wants to help protect conservation. And as a result, if we think about environmental quality, it's a normal good, right, for you economists. It's a normal good. As we increase our income, we desire more environmental quality, and we can afford to pay for more environmental quality. So as we see the Plum Creeks of the world going out there and doing this real estate development, suddenly they're starting to think about, oh, wait, if I leave this little area as a conservation easement, and we have some spotted owls over there, or some cool species that these really wealthy people want to be able to say, I have a endangered species on my land, whatever it might be. Suddenly there's a big value for that. But you have to be pretty wealthy to make that work, right? So the marketplace doesn't always satisfy all of us either, but we also need to think about where we are in the spectrum of wealth, because as we become wealthier, we do tend to protect the environment more. If you look at some of our developing countries, look at Malala, they're not really interested in going out there and spending a whole lot to protect the environment, because they're still just trying to get enough food in their mouths, right, and to protect themselves and to survive. And that needs to be taken care of first before we're going to see a huge investment in the environment. I don't know if that answered it at all, but.
I might ask about the wolves, and again a problem of public ownership, where the wolves themselves, the Yellowstone National Park, are not privately owned.
Sure, the wildlife in the United States is owned by the state, and we could say, well, what if defenders of wildlife owned the wolves down and they were liable? And that would be another potential solution. So then if the wolf came and killed your dog, defenders would be liable, right? So we could think of different types of property rights we could create. Again, we need to start from where we are, and that is probably not going to happen here in the United States. Now, it has happened in some of these other communities in South Africa and some of these other communities, Zimbabwe, where they have allowed for the ownership, private ownership of wildlife. And so we do see different types of solutions that occur